In the year 1984, an incident occurred involving a delivery truck carrying steel reinforcement bars from a foundry located in Chihuahua, Mexico, bound for New Mexico. The driver of this vehicle took an incorrect route, navigating through a side street that unexpectedly led him directly through the security checkpoint of Los Alamos National Laboratory, the facility where the atomic bomb was originally developed. As this truck proceeded past the gate, radiation detection alarms were triggered, producing loud warning signals. Security personnel immediately mobilized, initially suspecting that someone had smuggled radioactive materials out of the laboratory. However, the reality was quite different. The radiation signal was originating from the truck's cargo itself, the construction-grade steel rebar typically used in building foundations. This steel had become radioactive. And this is the critical detail that should deeply trouble you. The contamination had not originated from a nuclear reactor. It had not come from a weapons manufacturing facility. It had not resulted from any classified military operation. Instead, it had come from a hospital, a medical facility providing care to patients. When most people think about nuclear weapons, the image that comes to mind is nearly universal. A mushroom-shaped cloud, an intensely bright flash capable of burning shadows permanently onto pavement, the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is what we have been conditioned to fear through decades of education and media coverage. The atomic bomb represents the most awe-inspiring and destructive creation humans have ever produced. In mere milliseconds, a few kilograms of material can be transformed into an explosion with the force equivalent to thousands upon thousands of tons of conventional dynamite. The fear this generates is entirely justified. I was involved in the construction of these weapons and understand completely just how terrifying they truly are. However, I want to present you with a different investigation today. What if I revealed to you that something currently exists in hospitals, medical clinics, scientific research laboratories, and storage warehouses distributed worldwide that is, in certain fundamental ways, actually more hazardous than the bomb itself? I am not claiming it is more explosive or more powerful at the moment of detonation. Rather, I am saying it is more dangerous in the manner that actually matters in terms of real consequences. It has the capacity to poison an entire city, make buildings permanently uninhabitable, and cause people to experience prolonged illness for extended periods without understanding the source of their suffering. I intend to discover what this material is and investigate why it seems to receive so little attention from the public or authorities. Let us begin by examining the physics, because physics is always where the genuine narrative resides, hidden beneath layers of complexity. When a material exhibits radioactivity, it fundamentally means that the atomic nucleus is in an unstable state. The nucleus possesses either an excess number of protons, an excess number of neutrons, or an excess quantity of energy, and the nucleus naturally seeks to eliminate this surplus. Consequently, the nucleus undergoes the process of radioactive decay. It expels matter or energy. This ejected material might take the form of an alpha particle, which is essentially a helium nucleus made up of 2 protons and 2 neutrons stuck together. It could be a beta particle, which is fundamentally an electron moving at extremely high velocity. Alternatively, it might be a gamma ray, which is a packet of electromagnetic radiation possessing the characteristics of a photon. Gamma rays belong to the same category of radiation as visible light, but they carry vastly greater quantities of energy. This energy level is sufficient to dislodge electrons from their positions in atoms, disrupt the bonds connecting atoms in molecules, and destroy the structures of complex molecules. For our discussion today, gamma radiation demands special attention because gamma rays possess a remarkable property. They can pass through physical objects. Alpha particles, by contrast, are quite large and heavy, with a clumsy nature, and can be stopped by something as simple as a sheet of paper. Beta particles require only a thin sheet of aluminum to be stopped. However, gamma rays demand protection in the form of thick lead shielding, thick concrete barriers, or several inches of steel. Gamma rays penetrate walls. Gamma rays travel through clothing. Gamma rays pass directly through human bodies. A single gamma ray originating from cobalt-60 carries an energy level exceeding 1 million electron volts. In comparison, visible light, the type you use to see your surroundings, carries approximately 2 electron volts of energy. Therefore, we are discussing a photon that possesses roughly 500,000 times the energy content of ordinary light. This is not light in any conventional sense. This is equivalent to a bullet. When a gamma ray passes through human tissue, it does not simply pass through in the manner that sunlight passes through a window. Instead, it engages in interaction with your cells. The gamma ray dislodges electrons from the molecules within your cells. This is what scientists mean by the term ionizing radiation. It creates ionized atoms by dislodging electrons. When you remove an electron from a molecule residing in a living cell, you fundamentally alter that molecule. You modify its chemical properties and structure. In some situations, the cell possesses the capability to repair this damage. Your body contains remarkably efficient repair enzymes that can reconnect broken molecules and restore them to functional condition. However, the molecule that gamma rays preferentially damage is precisely the one you absolutely do not want damaged: your DNA, the complete instruction set that guides the function and development of every cell in your body. A single gamma ray possesses sufficient energy to fracture that DNA double helix, breaking both strands simultaneously. This represents what scientists call a double-strand break. While your repair enzymes typically can manage a single-strand break without significant difficulty, a double-strand break presents a considerably more serious problem. In some cases, the cell successfully identifies the broken pieces, correctly reconnects them, and continues functioning normally. In other cases, the cell makes mistakes. Sometimes it reconnects the incorrect pieces to each other, or it loses an important section of genetic code, or it introduces a mistake, a mutation, into the DNA sequence. If that mutation happens to occur in a gene that controls cell division, a gene that normally signals when a cell should stop multiplying, then you have created a cell that has lost the ability to regulate its own growth. This is the beginning of cancer. When exposure occurs at lower radiation levels, the cancer risk becomes a matter of statistics. One additional gamma ray will not definitively cause you to develop cancer, but it does increase the probability slightly. This probability accumulates progressively with each additional exposure event, much like repeatedly pulling the lever on a slot machine. Most pulls result in no reward, but every pull carries a potential for a prize. And if a radiation source is powerful enough, you find yourself pulling that lever millions upon millions of times every second. So, to summarize, radioactive decay, gamma rays, and DNA damage are all concepts you have likely encountered before in scientific discussions. What makes this background information relevant to the present discussion about hospital materials? Well, here is the crucial realization that many people do not fully appreciate. To successfully treat cancer through radiation therapy, you require an extremely potent source of gamma rays. You need a source capable of generating tremendous quantities of radiation concentrated into a very focused therapeutic beam so that you can point it at a tumor and annihilate the malignant cells. The method for achieving this involves using a specific radioactive isotope. Two isotopes in particular appear repeatedly in medical treatment settings. These are cobalt-60 and cesium-137. Let me provide details about cobalt-60. Cobalt-60 does not occur naturally anywhere on Earth. It must be artificially manufactured. The manufacturing process involves taking cobalt-59, which exists in a stable form, and placing it inside a nuclear reactor, where it is bombarded with a stream of neutrons. One of these neutrons becomes absorbed into the nucleus of the cobalt atom. After this absorption, you now have cobalt-60, which is radioactive and unstable. It decays by releasing a beta particle, and subsequently it releases two gamma rays, each carrying more than 1 million electron volts of energy. The half-life of cobalt-60 is approximately 5.3 years, meaning it decays at a rate fast enough to emit an intense continuous flow of gamma radiation. This is precisely what physicians want when attempting to eliminate tumors. Cesium-137 represents the other significant medical isotope. It is classified as a fission product, meaning it is one of the leftover fragments produced when uranium or plutonium nuclei are split during nuclear reactions. The half-life of cesium-137 is approximately 30 years, making it stay dangerously radioactive for an extremely extended period. Cesium-137 also releases gamma radiation, although at somewhat reduced energy levels compared to cobalt-60. Beyond these properties, cesium-137 possesses another concerning characteristic. In its standard medical preparation, called cesium chloride, it exists in a powder form that dissolves readily in water. This means if you make contact with it on your skin, it will dissolve into the skin tissue itself. If you inhale the powder, it penetrates your lungs. If you ingest it orally, it spreads throughout your entire body, collecting in your muscles and accumulating there, where it irradiates you from inside for months. Your entire body essentially becomes a radiation source, continuously emitting gamma rays. Consider these two substances, cobalt-60 and cesium-137, and recognize that they are stored within medical devices in hospitals located around the world, with thousands of such devices in operation. The International Atomic Energy Agency has catalogued more than 10,000 radiotherapy units in current medical use worldwide. This figure does not include industrial radiation sources used for inspecting pipeline integrity or sterilizing food products. When you include these industrial applications, you are facing many tens of thousands of highly radioactive sources distributed across every inhabited continent. These sources exist in hospitals, in warehouses, in manufacturing facilities, in locations where ordinary people conduct their daily work. This is where the investigation becomes particularly significant, so I must pose a question for you to seriously consider. What occurs when one of these radioactive sources disappears from its intended location? I do not mean in a fictional movie or a spy novel. I mean in actual reality. What happens when a hospital facility ceases operations or relocates to a new building or declares bankruptcy, and someone forgets about the radiotherapy device that is sitting abandoned in the basement? I have already mentioned the truck incident in New Mexico. Allow me to provide you with the complete narrative because this account possesses all the elements of a mystery thriller, albeit a troubling and tragic one. During the year 1983, a hospital located in Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, which sits directly on the border opposite El Paso, Texas, operated a radiation therapy unit. This particular unit was a Picker C3000 radiotherapy machine. Inside this device was a cobalt-60 source consisting of tiny pellets, each measuring approximately 1 millimeter in diameter, with roughly 6,000 individual pellets, the sum totaling more than 400 curies of radioactivity. The hospital had acquired this equipment 6 years previously and made a significant error. It never registered the equipment with the appropriate regulatory body. The hospital never officially notified any authority about the equipment's existence. Subsequent to this, a maintenance worker and an assistant removed the therapy machine from a storage location and loaded it onto a pickup truck bed. Their intention was to dispose of it as scrap material and profit from the sale of its components. During the transportation toward the junkyard, the protective capsule containing the radiation source became compromised and fractured. Approximately 1,000 of those microscopic cobalt-60 pellets spilled out into the truck bed. The men then sold the radiotherapy unit itself to the junkyard operator for approximately $10, after which they abandoned the truck on a residential street in the neighborhood. Since the truck's battery was completely dead, they left it there, untouched, for a period of 7 weeks. 7 full weeks. That pickup truck remained sitting on a street in a residential neighborhood where children would play outdoors. Later measurements indicated that the radiation exposure rate from parts of that truck reached 50 roentgens per hour. At a distance of 3 feet, this represented an extremely dangerous level of radiation. If you had positioned yourself next to that truck for several hours, you would have suffered severe and immediate medical consequences, requiring hospitalization. Yet the situation deteriorated further. Once the truck arrived at the scrapyard, the facility's operators utilized electromagnetic cranes to manipulate and move scrap metal pieces around the yard. These powerful magnets attracted the microscopic cobalt pellets and distributed them all throughout the entire scrapyard, mixing them thoroughly with thousands upon thousands of tons of other scrap metal. Subsequently, this contaminated scrap material was transported to two different metal foundries. One foundry specialized in producing construction rebar, while the other manufactured metal table bases. Both facilities melted the contaminated cobalt directly into the steel during their manufacturing processes. By January of 1984, the contaminated steel had been distributed to 17 distinct Mexican states and to multiple cities across the United States. The contamination included 6,600 tons of radioactive rebar, 30,000 contaminated table bases, buildings that had been constructed using radioactive steel as reinforcement, people eating dinner while seated at radioactive tables, and absolutely no one was aware of the contamination. The contamination was discovered purely by accident because a truck driver took a wrong turn near Los Alamos. Reflect on this situation carefully. If that truck had proceeded directly to its intended delivery destination, if the driver had successfully navigated to the correct location, the contamination might have remained undiscovered for many additional months, possibly for years. The radiation detection alarms at Los Alamos, which had been designed and installed to protect classified nuclear secrets, inadvertently functioned as an early detection system that prevented a public health disaster. The Mexican authorities were compelled to conduct radiation surveys at 17,000 individual buildings. 814 of those buildings contained sufficient contamination to warrant their demolition and removal. Tens of thousands of tons of contaminated material had to be excavated from the ground, loaded onto trucks, transported away, and buried in a specialized radioactive waste storage facility located in a desert region. Approximately 4,000 individual people had been exposed to above normal radiation levels. Some individuals exhibited damage to their chromosomes. At minimum, one worker subsequently developed bone cancer and died. This catastrophe originated from a hospital-owned machine that someone had simply overlooked and forgotten to properly manage and monitor. I want you to retain this narrative in your thoughts, because I possess another incident to share with you. This second incident is, if anything, considerably more severe and disturbing. By September 13th of 1987, in Goiânia, Brazil, a city containing approximately 1 million residents, situated in the interior of the country, roughly 600 miles away from São Paulo, an incident occurred. 2 years earlier, a private radiotherapy clinic known as the Instituto Goiano de Radiologia had relocated to a new facility. When relocating, the clinic abandoned their previous cesium-137 radiotherapy unit inside their former building without removing it. For 2 consecutive years, a legal dispute between the clinic and the property owner resulted in the building site being stuck in limbo, with the radioactive equipment simply sitting there, unguarded and unmonitored. 2 individuals who were searching for scrap metal discovered the abandoned machine. They transported it to their residence using a wheelbarrow, and over the subsequent few days, they managed to pry open the stainless steel protective capsule that contained the radioactive material. What they found inside was a fine powder, a water-soluble powder that was cesium chloride, containing approximately 93 grams of cesium-137, a mass comparable to the weight of a standard deck of playing cards. However, this powder possessed a remarkable quality. It emitted a beautiful, mysterious blue glow that was visible in darkened conditions. I want to pause the narrative at this juncture because the blue glow possesses significance. It is not what most individuals assume it to be. The blue light was not being emitted by the cesium itself. There was scientific disagreement regarding the precise mechanism producing the glow. Some physicists proposed that it might be Cherenkov radiation, which is essentially the optical equivalent of a sonic boom that occurs when charged particles from the radioactive decay travel through matter at velocities exceeding the speed of light within that medium. Other physicists suggested it might be ionized air emitting light, or fluorescence resulting from cesium chloride absorbing moisture from the surrounding air. Regardless of the specific mechanism involved, the observable result was unmistakable and unmistakable. In darkness, the powder released a subtle, captivating blue light, and that otherworldly glow signified a death sentence for anyone positioned near enough to observe it with clarity. The blue light fascinated the two men who had found the capsule, and therefore they did what many individuals might do if they did not comprehend the nature of what they were holding in their hands. They demonstrated it to their friends. They showed it to members of their family. One individual who owned a local scrapyard, a man named Di Ferreira, purchased the material and brought it into his own residence. He invited acquaintances and friends to come observe the mysterious glowing blue powder. Over the following several days, friends and family members passed the powder from person to person, handling it and examining it. One man used a screwdriver to carefully separate several grains of powder, each no larger than a grain of rice, from the main capsule and distributed them as gifts. Some people rubbed the powder onto their exposed skin, fascinated by the way it made them shimmer and glow in darkness. They used the powder to paint blue crosses onto the front of their shirts. They applied it to their faces as a decoration. One woman transported remnants of the powder on a city bus, thereby contaminating the vehicle and all its passengers. A small girl, aged 6 years old, niece of the scrapyard owner, consumed some of the powder. She was sitting on the floor of the scrapyard eating a sandwich which she held in her hands, and those hands were thoroughly covered in the blue powder. She thought the powder was beautiful and harmless. The cesium went directly from her hands into her body. 15 days elapsed before anyone established the connection between the spreading illness and the powder that had been circulating. People throughout the neighborhood began becoming sick. They experienced severe vomiting episodes. Their hair began to fall out. They developed painful burns across their skin surface. However, no one initially considered radiation as a possible cause. Why would they? This was a residential neighborhood in Brazil's interior, not a nuclear facility or research laboratory. It was the scrapyard owner's wife who eventually made the critical determination that the illness outbreak was causally connected to the glowing material. She collected the remaining powder and transported it to a hospital facility. By coincidence, a visiting medical physicist who had a scintillation counter-instrument available at the hospital confirmed the reality. The blue powder was extraordinarily radioactive. The city descended into panic. 112,000 residents flooded into hospitals demanding medical testing. Of all these people who sought testing, 249 individuals were confirmed to be contaminated. 28 of those contaminated individuals exhibited radiation burns visible on their skin. 4 people died from the exposure, among them the 6-year-old girl. She had accumulated an estimated radiation dose of 6 grays that had been absorbed into her small body from the cesium she had eaten. Her coffin had to be specially lined with lead and encased within a concrete shell. Because her body itself had transformed into a radiation source that continued emitting gamma rays even after death, she presented a radiation hazard to the funeral workers and others in close proximity. The cleanup and decontamination effort required demolishing multiple residential houses. Workers were compelled to scrape and remove the topmost layers of soil from contaminated sites. Massive quantities of personal possessions, furniture, clothing, and other materials had to be sealed inside containers and stored indefinitely as radioactive waste. The city's economy experienced total collapse. Other regions and provinces actively refused to purchase manufactured goods originating from Goiânia. Tourism to the city virtually stopped. The prices of manufactured products exported from Goiânia dropped by 40% and remained depressed for longer than a month. The city's population growth reversed as businesses relocated away. The economic losses reached into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and the psychological and emotional damage surpassed the physical damage in many respects. Over 100,000 residents descended upon hospital emergency departments, convinced they were dying from radiation poisoning. The majority of these individuals were fine in purely physical terms. However, the fear and psychological distress were absolutely genuine and profound. People became afraid to make physical contact with one another. They feared consuming food purchased at local markets. They worried constantly that the air they were breathing was quietly and gradually killing them. There exists a term in physics and sociology for what radiation accomplishes to a community beyond the strictly physical effects. Radiation poisons trust. It poisons the sense of safety in your own home, your own neighborhood, your own body, and your own existence. And here is what the physics guarantees will occur next. The decontamination process, regardless of how thorough it may appear superficially, will not have eliminated all radioactive material. Cesium chloride is water-soluble in nature. Rainwater causes it to dissolve and become liquid. The dissolved cesium migrates downward through layers of soil and eventually reaches groundwater reserves. The physics absolutely guarantees that the contamination will expand slowly, silently, and persistently for as long as the cesium continues to exist in its radioactive form. You can pour concrete slabs over the contaminated sites, yet the cesium does not respect physical barriers. It spreads around concrete, beneath it, through microscopic cracks. Based on the physics of radioactive decay, I would confidently wager that decades later, scientists will document elevated cesium concentrations deep within the soil beneath those hastily decontaminated sites in Guyana. And the waste material, tons and tons and tons of it, must remain stored inside containers with lead lining for longer than 180 years. 180 years represents 6 half-lives. 6 complete half-lives must pass before the cesium-137 decays to a level that is generally considered acceptably safe. 180 years of continuous vigilance, of monitoring, of guaranteeing that no one mistakenly opens the wrong storage container. 93 grams of powder, the mass equivalent to a small bar of soap. And now I want to explain precisely why I am declaring this more dangerous than a nuclear bomb. Let me be extremely specific about what my statement means. I am not saying it is more destructive in the moment of detonation or use. A nuclear weapon detonation is absolutely, beyond question, the single most devastating phenomenon a human being can unleash into the world. Nothing, absolutely nothing, comes close to the destructive power of the blast, the fireball, the enormous shock wave that follows. However, contemplate this carefully. A nuclear explosion is a singular event. It occurs, and subsequently it concludes. The blast wave itself lasts a fraction of a second. The thermal radiation pulse continues for a few seconds. The immediate burst of radiation lasts several seconds. Now, radioactive fallout does descend after a nuclear explosion, and that fallout is dangerous and persists for a long time. But the bomb itself, as a physical device, essentially destroys itself in the act of detonating. There is nothing left of the weapon after the explosion concludes. The fissile material is either consumed in the reaction or is scattered widely. And here is something subtle about nuclear detonation that most people do not fully appreciate. The extraordinarily intense temperatures and pressures produced by the nuclear fireball actually destroy significant quantities of the radioactive material. Fission products are indeed created and produced, but they are lofted to great heights into the upper atmosphere, spread across vast geographic distances, and diluted by mixing with enormous volumes of air. The radioactive fallout from a nuclear weapon eventually settles across hundreds or thousands of square miles of territory. This distribution means that the radioactivity concentration per square meter at most geographic locations is comparatively low. Dangerous, certainly, but distributed thin, comparable to spilling a glass containing poison into a swimming pool versus pouring that same poison into a cup of coffee. In contrast, a medical radiation source is not a singular explosive event. It is a persistent condition. It remains in one location, quietly, invisibly, releasing gamma rays continuously for years, extending into decades. A medical source fits within the palm of your hand. It weighs merely a few ounces. It is manufactured in the thousands globally, and it can be stolen and taken away by two unemployed men equipped with a wheelbarrow. And there is a dark irony that exists here that connects these two things, bombs and medical sources, more directly than you might initially expect. Physicists have known about a theoretical weapons concept for many years called the cobalt bomb. It is a nuclear weapon that is engineered not simply to detonate, but specifically to contaminate vast areas. You take a nuclear warhead and surround it with a thick shell composed of ordinary cobalt-59. When the bomb detonates, the intense burst of neutrons from the nuclear explosion converts that cobalt-59 into cobalt-60. It becomes cobalt-60, the identical cobalt-60 used in hospitals for medical purposes. And that newly created cobalt-60 is subsequently dispersed throughout the atmosphere as radioactive fallout. This is not ordinary nuclear fallout that decays away in days or weeks. This is cobalt-60 fallout, possessing a half-life of over 5 years, sufficient to render a vast geographic region completely uninhabitable for decades into the future. Some theoretical physicists have calculated that detonating enough cobalt bombs could theoretically make the entire planetary surface too dangerously radioactive for human habitation. No nation has constructed a cobalt bomb, as far as historical records indicate. The concept was too abhorrent, even during the height of the Cold War. However, nature displays indifference to human intentions and motivations. Every hospital radiotherapy unit containing cobalt-60 is, in a certain sense, a pre-assembled, tiny component of that nuclear nightmare scenario. Not because anyone intends to use it for that destructive purpose, but because the physics does not differentiate between intended purpose and accidental outcome. The gamma rays emitted from a cobalt-60 source operating in a cancer treatment clinic are absolutely identical to the gamma rays that would be released from a cobalt bomb. The isotope is identical, the decay process is identical, the energy levels are identical. The sole difference resides in how the cobalt-60 arrived at its current location and what physical mechanisms are maintaining it in a safe, contained condition. That asymmetry should inspire genuine terror. Let me clarify the physics that explains why concentrated radioactive sources inspire such intense fear and concern. The concentration is the factor that creates the critical difference. There exists an important concept in radiation physics termed specific activity. This means the quantity of radioactivity that you obtain per unit mass of material. And this concept carries tremendous significance and importance. Think about it in this manner. The world's oceans contain radioactive materials throughout their vast volumes. Uranium is dissolved within seawater. Potassium-40 exists in every wave. If you sum all the radioactivity existing in the ocean, the total is an enormous number. However, that radioactivity is distributed among 330 million trillion gallons of water. Therefore, the radioactivity concentration per gallon is negligible, essentially insignificant. You could swim in ocean water throughout an entire day, and the radiation exposure would not be a concern. Now imagine taking that same quantity of radioactive material and compressing it into a cylinder about the size of your thumb. That is what a medical radiation source represents. The activity might be hundreds or thousands of curies, compressed into a volume no bigger than a sugar cube. The radiation emission from that tiny object is absolutely staggering, not because the total radioactivity is greater than the radioactivity in the ocean. It is not. But because it is all concentrated into a single location, compressed, focused, exactly like the difference between sunlight distributed across an entire field and sunlight concentrated through a magnifying glass onto a single point of focus. There is a fundamental law that you study in the first week of any physics course that governs this principle. It is called the inverse square law. If you double your distance away from a radiation source, the intensity of radiation drops to 1/4 of its previous level. If you triple your distance, the intensity drops to 1/9. This sounds reassuring, right? Move farther away and you are safe. But here is the reciprocal relationship. If you move closer to the source, the intensity increases according to the same mathematical principle. Cut the distance in half, and the intensity quadruples. And medical radiation sources are specifically engineered to create concentration. They compress enormous activity into a miniature volume because that is the method for delivering a therapeutic dose to a cancerous tumor. The whole purpose is to create an incredibly intense source of radiation inside the smallest feasible space. When a cobalt-60 therapy head operates during a treatment, the radiation source might be no bigger than a pencil eraser. Yet within that tiny space, the activity might be thousands upon thousands of curies. Stand 1 meter away from an unshielded source of that intensity, and you can receive a dose that is lethal in minutes, not hours, minutes. And the other characteristic of concentrated sources that distinguishes them from dispersed nuclear fallout is that they can be physically picked up, carried from place to place, placed inside your pocket, transported home, and positioned on your kitchen table. You cannot pick up a nuclear explosion and bring it home to display to your acquaintances. But you can do exactly that with a cesium-137 capsule. That is precisely what occurred in Goiânia. I want to address something different now, something that the physics forces us to acknowledge and understand. The concept of what transpires within your body when you ingest a radioactive substance. Because external radiation exposure and internal radiation exposure are fundamentally different phenomena. If a gamma-ray source is positioned outside your body at a distance across the room, the inverse square law operates in your favor, with every inch of distance reducing your accumulated dose. And when you leave the room, the radiation exposure ceases. Your body stops absorbing radiation. However, if you consume cesium-137 or inhale it as dust or absorb it through your skin, the radioactive source is now located within you, and you cannot position yourself at a distance from your own organs. The cesium distributes throughout your muscles because chemically it behaves quite similarly to potassium, which your body actively absorbs and utilizes. It settles into your muscle tissue and irradiates you from the interior 24 hours per day. While you sleep, while you eat, while you embrace your children, you are being irradiated by the material residing within yourself. The biological half-life of cesium-137 in the human body, meaning the time required for your body to excrete half of it through normal metabolic processes, is approximately 70 days. That represents a substantial amount of time to have a gamma-ray emitting substance sitting in your muscles, quietly and continuously breaking apart your DNA. There is a treatment available called Prussian blue, which is a compound that attaches to cesium in your digestive system and enables your body to eliminate it faster. However, you must recognize that you have been contaminated in order to seek treatment. And in Goiânia, 15 days elapsed before anyone realized what was happening. 15 days of internal irradiation occurring silently within people's bodies. So, let me step back and survey the broader situation from a wider perspective, because I have provided you with narratives of two distinct incidents, Ciudad Juárez and Goiânia. You might be reasoning that these were unusual and extraordinary accidents, isolated occurrences that do not represent broader patterns. But that is incorrect. These incidents were not isolated. In 1962, in Mexico City, a 10-year-old boy located a cobalt-60 source in an outdoor field. He placed it into his trouser pocket. He carried it with him for days. 4 people residing in his household subsequently died from the radiation exposure. In 1978, in Algeria, a construction worker discovered a small metal container at a construction site and transported it to his home. It was an iridium-192 industrial radiography source. His entire family was exposed to radiation for an extended period. These incidents are not anomalies or statistical outliers. They are manifestations of a systemic problem. And this systemic problem continues expanding and intensifying because we keep manufacturing additional radioactive sources. And simultaneously, the world keeps evolving and transforming around those sources. Governments experience collapse and instability. Hospitals cease operations and close. Economic systems fall into crisis, and the radioactive sources remain, continuing to emit radiation quietly, waiting. At this current moment, there are radiotherapy units operating in hospital facilities across Africa, across South America, across Asia, in nations where the regulatory and enforcement infrastructure is fragile, weak, or simply non-existent. Some of these units are many decades old. Some are located in medical facilities that are inadequately funded, inadequately maintained, inadequately staffed. And inevitably, some of those facilities will shut down, will be abandoned, or will be looted for their valuable materials. This has already happened twice in the past 4 years that we have documented knowledge of. But how many times has it happened that nobody noticed? How many more times will occur before someone starts paying attention? These are not hypothetical scenarios existing only in imagination. These are real incidents, and they continue occurring with increasing regularity because the fundamental challenge has not been addressed and solved. The fundamental issue is this: we possess tremendous capability at manufacturing radioactive sources, and we possess inadequate capability at monitoring and keeping track of them. The International Atomic Energy Agency uses a term to describe this situation: orphaned sources. It is a euphemistic label. An orphaned source is a radioactive source that has escaped from regulatory oversight and control. It was not disposed of correctly. It was misplaced, abandoned, lost, stolen, or simply overlooked and forgotten. Nobody is overseeing it. Nobody is conducting monitoring. It is just out there, somewhere, continuously emitting radiation. How many orphaned sources exist distributed throughout the world? The truthful answer is that nobody knows with certainty. The IAEA estimates that the number already reaches into the hundreds, probably extending into the thousands. In the former Soviet Union, tens of thousands of radioactive devices are deployed throughout that immense territory, in remote lighthouses positioned along the Arctic coastline, in manufacturing facilities, in hospital locations, in military installations. Numerous of these sources are powered by strontium-90 thermoelectric generators that function for many decades without requiring maintenance. Record-keeping is inadequate. Security is frequently even worse. And when governments change, when economies collapse, when institutions weaken and fail, those radioactive sources do not disappear. They simply become harder to locate and monitor. Even in the United States, which maintains one of the most sophisticated and advanced regulatory systems anywhere in the world, radioactive sources have already been lost, misplaced, or disposed of improperly. The number is not large, but it is not zero either. And some is sufficient, because it only takes a single source escaping control. And we possess direct knowledge of what occurs when sources slip past safety systems. We witnessed it in Ciudad Juarez. We witnessed it in Goiânia. And around 1983, construction was finished on approximately 1,700 apartment buildings in Taiwan that were constructed using steel that was contaminated with cobalt-60. Nobody detected it during that time period. The contamination has remained undetected up until the present. When the contamination is eventually discovered, and it will be, those buildings will have been exposing their inhabitants to radiation for years, possibly for decades. Thousands of people have slept each night surrounded by radioactive steel, eaten breakfast inside homes where the walls quietly emit gamma rays continuously. Reportedly, more than 100 nations may lack the basic regulatory systems and infrastructure necessary to properly manage and control their radioactive sources. Contemplate that number. More than 100 countries where a hospital can shut down operations and the cesium-137 therapy unit in the basement can simply remain there, unguarded, unmonitored, waiting for someone to decide it has scrap value and can be sold. I want you to grasp something important about the physics in this situation, because the physics is what makes this problem distinctly different from other industrial hazards and dangers. Most hazardous industrial materials experience degradation in the everyday sense. They break down, they corrode, they lose their dangerousness and potency. Dynamite that is decades old, sweats nitroglycerin and becomes unstable and dangerous. But it also gradually deteriorates and becomes less dangerous. Ancient chemicals decompose and break down. Biological agents eventually die and cease functioning. Radioactive sources do not diminish their danger on any human timescale, but they do diminish it on their own timescale, which is established by their specific radioactive half-life, and you have absolutely no control or influence over that timescale. You cannot accelerate the decay process. You cannot chemically neutralize it. You cannot treat it with a compound to make it safe. There is no antidote for cobalt-60. The only actions you can perform are to shield it, lock it securely away, and wait patiently. 5.3 years for half of it to decay, 10.6 years for 3/4 to decay, 15.8 years for 7/8 to decay. And even after all that time, the remainder may still constitute a danger. You are bound to nature's timeline, not your own timeline. With cesium-137, you are waiting for generations. Your grandchildren will be managing waste from a source that was manufactured during your lifetime. Now, I brought up dirty bombs earlier, and I should address that subject because it constitutes part of this puzzle. But it also functions somewhat as a distraction, or red herring. People worry about someone assembling a radiological dispersal device, taking a medical source, wrapping it in conventional explosives, and detonating it in a populated city. And yes, that is a legitimate concern that deserves attention. Military strategists have spent many years discussing and analyzing it. The materials are available. The engineering is uncomplicated compared to creating a nuclear weapon. It could be accomplished. However, the real specialists, the genuine experts, will reveal something noteworthy. Creating a dirty bomb using cobalt-60 is extraordinarily difficult because the material is so intensely radioactive that handling it without protection will be fatal to the person before they can even assemble the device. The gamma radiation is intense enough to deliver a lethal dose in merely minutes just from holding the material. You would require sophisticated shielding, remote manipulation equipment, and considerable technical expertise. Not impossible, but quite difficult. And the actual impact of a dirty bomb in terms of radiation exposure to members of the public is regularly exaggerated. Computer modeling indicates that detonating 50 grams of cesium chloride in a major metropolitan area would generate a radiation plume that exposes people to elevated levels of radiation. Yes, that is accurate. But at distances beyond several hundred meters, the additional cancer risk might be relatively small, perhaps 1 in 1,000. The explosion itself would probably kill more individuals than the radiation would. So why do security experts continue expressing concern about it? Because the real damage from a dirty bomb is not measured in Röntgens of radiation. It is measured in psychological fear, in economic disruption, in the enormous costs required to decontaminate buildings and streets. It is measured in psychological trauma when an entire city is informed that the ground they walk on, the atmosphere they breathe, might be slowly harming them. That fear, that uncertainty, is the genuine weapon. And the physics sustains that concern because decontamination is genuinely challenging, time-consuming, and financially expensive. And the radioactive material does not disappear just because you desire it to. But I have been gradually leading you toward contemplation of the dirty bomb scenario. And now I want to redirect your focus backward, because the dirty bomb is the scenario that people's imaginations conjure, and it is not the scenario that actually keeps happening. What genuinely keeps repeating is considerably more straightforward and far more frequent. What actually happens is that a source vanishes from the system. The hospital closes down operations. A therapy unit is abandoned in a storage location. Someone who lacks knowledge about radioactive hazards discovers it and sells it for scrap metal value. And by the time anyone recognizes what has transpired, the harm has already been inflicted. And that is the actual danger. Not a dramatic act of terrorism, not a mushroom-shaped cloud rising into the sky. Simply neglect. Ordinary human carelessness and inattention. The failure to track a small metal capsule in a world that manufactures tens of thousands of them every year. And the physics is merciless and unforgiving because the source does not care whether you are paying attention to it. It does not care whether you possess a regulatory framework or an inventory system or a radiation safety officer. It decays on its own predetermined schedule. It emits gamma rays whether or not anyone is present to measure them. It damages DNA whether or not the person nearby comprehends the nature of DNA. I think this is one of the profoundest lessons that physics teaches us all. Nature does not negotiate. Nature does not pause and wait for you to reach a state of readiness. The laws apply and are enforced whether you comprehend them or not. And when you create something as potent as a medical radiation source, you have made a commitment to the future. You have committed that someone will maintain careful vigilance over this object for many years. And if that promise is broken, the consequences will arrive with the certainty of a mathematical equation. Let me address something that appears ordinary and routine, but is actually profoundly significant. Shielding. The reason these sources remain safe when enclosed inside a radiotherapy machine is because they are surrounded by lead, substantial, thick lead. The gamma rays emitted from a cobalt-60 source encounter the thick nuclei of lead atoms and are absorbed, preventing them from exiting. What emerges on the opposite side is radiation at manageable levels. The machine includes an opening, an aperture that opens to permit a controlled beam to exit when you desire to treat a patient, and then it closes. Lead surrounding everything on all sides, steel casing bolted and locked shut. The entire safety of this entire system depends on the integrity and condition of that protective container. If the lead remains unbroken, if the container stays intact, the source is safe. You can position yourself right next to it for an extended period, and your radiation exposure is negligible. But if the container cracks, if the capsule is punctured, if that opening window is opened and left open, you suddenly have an unshielded gamma radiation source, potent enough to deliver you a lethal dose in the duration it requires to consume a meal. The distinction between safe and lethal is measured in a few centimeters of lead. This is what the scrap metal collectors in Goiânia did not comprehend. This is what the maintenance workers in Ciudad Juarez did not comprehend. That the shielding was the single factor standing between them and death. They removed it without recognizing what they were removing because they could not read the warning labels on the container. In certain cases, the warning labels had deteriorated or had been painted over and obscured. The international trefoil symbol meaning nothing to them. Why would it? Nobody had ever explained to them what it represented. And that brings me to what I regard as the deepest and most fundamental problem of all. It is not a problem of physics. It is a problem of human nature and human communication. How do you communicate a warning about a danger that is invisible, that has no odor, that has no taste, that makes no sound? A danger that does not cause pain immediately, that does not signal its presence, that can be causing you serious harm while you feel perfectly healthy and well. With the majority of hazards, nature provides a warning signal. Fire produces burning sensations. Acid stings and burns the skin. Poison tastes bitter and unpleasant. Sharp, pointed objects produce cuts and pain. You get feedback and learn from it. But ionizing radiation provides absolutely no sensory feedback or warning. You cannot experience or sense gamma rays traveling through your body. You do not experience taste when cesium-137 dissolves on your tongue. The first noticeable sign of acute radiation exposure, nausea, does not manifest for many hours, and if the dose is not immediately lethal but still harmful, the long-term effects, cancer development, genetic damage, might not become apparent for many years. This is precisely why warning systems and safeguards are absolutely essential. And this is precisely why failures of those systems are so catastrophic and destructive when they occur. Because the source does not warn you about itself. It relies entirely on human-made systems, warning labels, mechanical locks, computerized inventories, government regulations, to maintain distance between people and the radioactive material. And when those human systems fail, when they malfunction or are neglected, There is nothing else. There is no smell to alert you. There is no pain to make you drop the object. Nothing. I contemplate what the experience must have been like in that neighborhood in Goiânia. People applying glowing blue powder to their exposed skin, painting blue crosses onto their shirts, distributing pieces of it to their children, thinking it was something beautiful, something magical, something wonderful. And the entire time, gamma rays were passing through their cells, breaking apart their DNA, and they could not perceive it at all. The beauty was the danger. The glow was the warning that nobody understood how to decode. 93 grams, with mass comparable to a bar of soap. 4 people dead. 249 contaminated. 112,000 rushing to hospitals in terror. An entire city's economy destroyed. Neighborhoods demolished, soil scraped away, and the contamination persists, still seeping downward through the soil decades later. Compare that requirement to manufacturing a nuclear weapon. To construct a nuclear weapon, you require a nation-state, uranium enrichment facilities, billions of dollars invested, thousands of scientists dedicated to the task. The materials are protected with the complete military and intelligence power of a government. International treaties establish monitoring of every gram of materials suitable for weapons. Satellites positioned in space maintain continuous observation of the facilities. A cesium-137 therapy unit can be stolen by 2 unemployed individuals carrying a wheelbarrow. So what conclusions have we reached? What have we discovered? We have learned that the most concentrated, portable, dangerous radioactive materials on the entire planet are not secured in weapons storage bunkers. They are sitting in hospital facilities and medical clinics, in research laboratories, in industrial manufacturing plants. Tens of thousands of them scattered across every continent. We have learned that these materials remain dangerous for periods of decades or extending into centuries. We have learned that when they escape from regulatory control, through simple carelessness, through poverty and lack of resources, through institutional collapse, the consequences are devastating and persist for extended periods. We have learned that the physics of radiation provides no warning, no opportunity to correct mistakes. The damage is done before you even realize the process has begun. And we have learned that the safety systems we depend on are precisely as reliable as the weakest component in the chain. A hospital that relocates without informing anyone about the machine in the basement. A regulatory agency that lacks sufficient funding. A worker at a junkyard who cannot read a warning label. A delivery truck driver who takes a wrong turn at an intersection. I do not possess a neat, tidy answer for you. I am a physicist, not a policy specialist. But I can tell you what the physics demands. The physics demands unrelenting vigilance. Not for a single year, not for a single decade, but for the entire operational lifetime of the source. And for certain materials, that lifetime extends far beyond any human institution we have ever constructed or created. Think carefully about that reality. We are manufacturing objects that will remain dangerous for longer than most governmental systems endure, longer than most human languages persist and continue to be spoken, longer than most building structures stand and remain intact. How do you communicate a warning to someone living 180 years in the future? How do you guarantee that records and documentation will survive, that languages will still be understood, that warning symbols will still communicate their meaning? This represents a problem that we have not yet addressed. We have barely commenced serious thinking about it. And every single year, additional sources are manufactured, deployed in hospitals, and some portion of them slip through the cracks and become part of the population of orphaned sources, drifting through the world without tracking, without observation, still continuously emitting radiation. The nuclear bomb announces itself loudly. The bomb is dramatic and spectacular. The bomb commands our concentration and our attention and our psychological fear. However, the object in the hospital basement is different. It is quiet, patient, invisible. It does not need a detonator, a firing mechanism, or a delivery system. It requires only for someone to forget about it. And that, I think, is the most perilous kind of danger that exists. I devoted a substantial portion of my career examining the big scientific questions, the fundamental physical laws, the symmetries of nature, the deep underlying structure of matter itself. But I acquired knowledge along my professional journey that I think carries more importance than any equation I ever managed to write or derive. The universe does not adjust grades based on effort. It does not award partial credit for good intentions. It does not care whether you intended well or worked diligently or were ignorant of the consequences. The gamma ray hits the DNA molecule or it does not. The cell transforms into a cancer cell or it does not. The radioactive source is properly monitored or it is lost. Physics is honest, relentlessly, painfully honest and direct. And the honest truth about the object resting in that hospital basement is that it is simultaneously a wonder and a threat. And the sole factor differentiating one from the other is the attentiveness, the discipline, the institutional memory of the human beings charged with responsibility for it. That is what I would like you to contemplate, not merely today, but each and every time you hear the word nuclear and your mind instantly recalls the mushroom cloud. Ask yourself, where are the radioactive sources? Who is maintaining oversight? And what transpires when the oversight ceases?